Welcome One Life Henderson and One Life West and One Life East. And I just want to add my voice to a couple things. First of all, in our apparel that we're offering, we do offer a middle-aged man model, okay? And so you can look almost as good as this if you want to look at that apparel. But I do want to say this. We brought up Kickstart a while ago as Sarah was talking about that. It's coming up next week. And I always encourage anyone, many of you are visiting here at the first part of the year, and my challenge to you is if you feel like this might be a place that you can enjoy plugging in, always make the big room smaller. You go to any church, always make the big room smaller. You don't want to continue to be just a face in the crowd, and we don't want you to be a face in the crowd. We want you to be someone who's connected to other people, cared about, feels like you're a part of things. When you walk in these doors, it's not a strange place. And if you're around that place where you would like to meet some people and that kind of thing, we set up Kickstart to be an easy step into that whole thing. It will tell you more about our church and who we are and what we're about, but the real goal is to make it where you feel like you are a part of things by the time you're done with it. So that's starting next week. You know, there's one little phrase in our culture that I like, and maybe I like it because I'm a preacher and I do public speaking and that bit, but it's the mic drop moment. You probably heard that one. That was a real mic drop moment. You can look up on YouTube and they'll say famous mic drop moments, and you can look at these clips that kind of go through. And President Obama, whenever he gave his last State of the Union speech, he did the famous, probably the most famous mic drop moment. He took the mic off the podium and he dropped it on the floor. And it just means, you know, that was so irrefutable, so in the zone that all the person had to do was just sort of drop the mic and walk away. You're like, okay. So in the Bible, believe it or not, as I was thinking about this, there is a section that's talked about that I think it could be argued that Jesus had the original mic drop moment. And now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, well, first of all, I'm not saying he had a mic. I do know that part. He didn't have a mic, arguably. But it was that, and I don't think he was of the style that would necessarily, I don't picture Jesus going and kind of cocky doing that kind of thing. But I do think, based upon what's recorded about the moment and everybody's reaction to the moment, you could qualify it that way. It says this, and this is the conclusion, keep in mind, of what I want to remind you is the most famous and world-impacting message ever given by anyone. I think we forget that every now and then. We come into church and some of these words are very familiar to us. These are the final words of what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. And it's familiar to so many of us, we forget what it is. Over 2,000 years, history would prove this. I don't care what you think about Jesus one way or the other. This is without a doubt the most famous discourse ever given, and certainly the most influential around the world by anybody's standards, the Sermon on the Mount. And he concluded it this way: therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine, who does not act on them, will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. When Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who having authority and not as their scribes. I want you to keep your mind and heart on that, because what we're doing is we've started a series last week, the beginning of this year, called Build. And what it's all about, and you'll learn this in Kickstart, you'll know that we're built around 12 different values that kind of make up our personality, who we are at One Life. And one of those 12 values, we say it this way, is we don't want to build just great churches, we want to build great cities, locally and globally. We want to be city builders. We want to be people that go out in our community and contribute and make things better, whether they're in the area of commerce or education or the arts or whatever it may be. We want to be contributors. And the goal of this series, let me remind you again, is that when we say that, and we say it often, we want everybody by the end of this series, everybody that calls himself a one-lifer, to have a get-it factor. Like, okay, I understand what it means when we say that. It's not just words, that things are going on, people are contributing. The second thing I'm hoping you will do, and as your pastor, I can really encourage you to do this, is I'm hoping you will see yourself inside of it. Once you understand it, you'll see what your contribution is. I think if you will get a hold of this, this kind of thing, which I did years ago, when you get a hold of this, how your life contributes to the city around you, both locally and globally, It'll change your life. It'll change you how you work, you look at your work, how you look at education, how you look at the arts and all the rest. And then finally, what we said was, as we go through this stuff, the principles of building a great city are really, in the end, the principles of building a great life. And so what we're really studying is, how do you build a great life from the ground up? And it started with this concept. We said in the Bible, and this is one of the examples. We didn't look at this one last week, but really I borrowed the imagery that Jesus closes the great Sermon on the Mount, where he opens by saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he goes on to talk about marriage, and he goes on to talk about your words. He talks about your work. He talks about the words of your mouth and the attitudes of your heart. And then he closes out with this foundation speech. And he uses that metaphor. Now, what we found last week, and I'm gonna quote this again, we said we're gonna use that metaphor throughout this whole thing, and I found a definition of a foundation on a site about building houses. I didn't know anything about building houses, so I thought I'd look it up. And this was the definition I gave last week. I'm gonna give it again, of a foundation. By definition, a home's foundation is the load-bearing portion of the structure, typically built below ground. By definition, a home's foundation is the load-bearing portion of the structure, typically built below ground. In other words, you need something under your feet. You need something under your soul. The city needs something under it that can bear the weight, that can bear the load, because we know that life can press down. Life can get difficult. Life can get hard. And you really need to think in terms of, what's my life really centered around? What's it built around? What's it anchored to? And so last week we said this. And it sounds very, very churchy, and it sounds very, very predictable, but I don't want you to think of it that way. We said absolutely the foundation of everyone's life, the load-bearing portion, if you really want to have a load-bearing portion, is this: a living, breathing, growing, deepening relationship with Jesus Christ. That I am convinced after experience, I'm convinced after looking at his word, I'm convinced intellectually, emotionally, and everything from observations through life. I've lived long enough to say, I've watched people who have taken terrible loads, heavy loads, that you can't imagine how they were able to carry that thing. And I know almost to the person, it's always, they don't fall because they have a living, breathing, growing, deepening relationship with Jesus. Now, what we want to do today is, though, I want to explore, based upon Jesus' words about the whole foundation thing. I don't want those just to be cliche words. I want us to understand, when we say a living, breathing, growing, a deepening relationship with Jesus, what that really means and what it includes, so it'll be something we actually can get our heads around. And this is for people who are brand new to this, those of you who may be exploring the Christian faith, or those of you who have been doing this stuff for a long time. I think Jesus' words here can instruct us a whole lot, because what they do is they give the ingredients of a great foundation. As I was studying the foundation thing with homes, they're made up of essentially three things. You build a home or a building, it's made up of dirt, it's made up of concrete, and made up of steel. Dirt, concrete, steel. It's kind of three different things that hold a structure there, that bear the weight of it. And what Jesus does in these words is he gives essentially three basic things that you and I need to have consciously and intentionally in our lives to have a load-bearing structure. And the first one's this. Notice what he says. He opens up. I want you to imagine Jesus. He's talking to a crowd, and they're all listening to him, and he's spoken on all these things. And at the end, he essentially says, there's two kinds of people listening to me right now. And I want you to note, before I tell you what they are, what he does not say. He doesn't say at the end of this awesome speech, this world-class, amazing, most influential speech ever given, all right, the first group of you, those of you who want to follow me and sign on to what I just said and buy what I'm selling, here's how things are going to go for you. The skies are going to be blue overhead. The grass is going to be lush underneath. And the breeze is going to be gentle on your cheek. That's what life is going to look like for you if you will just sign on this dotted line for $99.95. He doesn't say that. Easy payments, $99.95. He says, both groups, he uses this rhetorical device. And he says, some of you, or all of you, are going to have three things happen. Rain's going to fall. Floods are going to happen. Yeah, that's the other one. Floods are going to happen. And the wind is going to, and I have a love-hate relationship with this word. It's translated in the NAS. It says the winds slammed against that house. I love the picturesque version of that word, but I hate the concept. Think about this. The rains are going to fall. the floods are going to rise, and the winds are going to slam against both groups of people. In other words, everybody's going to get their chance. And in those days, they lived around Palestine and in the upper Palestine area around the Sea of Galilee. They were used to storms kind of sweeping in out of nowhere. They were used to having places where little streams that were about this big could turn into kind of raging miniature rivers and floods. I guarantee you, many of the people that he was talking to had actually seen it happen where a guy built a house on a beach. And they just watched floodwaters just take the thing away. It would have been a very, very common image for them. He would have been pulling on the imagery that they had in their minds. He divides them up. So both groups, rains are going to fall, floods are going to rise, and the winds are going to slam. You ever been slammed before by life? And if you say no, well, you will. You get your turn if you stick around long enough. So then he says 3 ingredients are holding them together. And what he does with this rhetorical device, though, he says both groups that he was talking to had things in common. 2 of the 3. But we're going to go through all 3. The first one's this. He who hears these words of mine, he says. The first place I want to start with, if you really want to know what a real foundation looks like, it comes back to Jesus. He says, he who hears these words of mine. For that, I want to remind you of what it says about the crowds. You remember when he dropped his microphone? And it says the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Amazed. I was really intrigued by that word amazed. And so I looked it up in my Greek dictionary to see what it meant. And I thought I was looking up the wrong word. I'm just quoting from my Greek dictionary, the word translated in the English, amazed. This is what it says, amazed. To strike out, expel by a blow or hit, drive away, to cast off, to strike with panic, shock. I'm like, I thought the word was translated amazed. And it's given this image to strike with a blow. So in other words, when Jesus concluded and he did drop the mic, the crowd's response was not, oh, wow, that was really, really good. I got a lot out of that. Did you get a lot out of that? Boy, that was really, yes, I laughed, I cried, I had tears running down my cheek. I listened to almost the whole thing, the whole time. It was amazing. You know what the reaction really was? It wasn't, ooh, nice job. We'll come back next week, give you 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. What the reaction really was, to strike a blow, shock means, it's one of those things. It's like they were all sitting there kind of dumbfounded like, whoa. We've never heard anything like that. So we're shocked, they were amazed, they were freaked out, if you will. And here's the reason. It says because he taught as one who had authority. Now, if you were back in that culture in that day, you were a Jewish person, you were raised in a very religious environment. Most of them had been taught the Bible throughout their entire lives, and they had heard it ever since they were kids and all the rest. But the way they heard it and the way their scribes, it says, he taught as one who had authority, not like their scribes. Well, the way their scribes taught was the scribes would stand up in front of them and they would read a passage from the Old Testament part of the Bible, and then they would quote other authorities. They were trained to do that. They would say, well, the great Rabbi Hillel says this about this passage. Well, the great Rabbi Shammai says this about this passage. In addition to being dull as dirt, it also was always pulling on people's authority, other people's authority. So they were used to hearing that for years and years and years and years and years. And here's the characteristic of Jesus' speech on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, he who hears these words of mine. Jesus, throughout the whole thing, it's unmistakable. Go back and read it for yourself. He says about himself all the time, he's the authority. He'll even say, you heard it said back there before, but I tell you this. You've heard it said, but I tell you this. He points to himself all the time. As a matter of fact, I've heard it said that Jewish people, modern day and Jewish people, a number of them do not have rejected, by and large, the nation of Israel has rejected Jesus as Messiah. And that's not everybody. There are Messianic Jews, but many of them reject. And one of the main reasons I've heard it said is because he comes to them, he comes across like an egomaniac. He was talking about himself. You've heard it was said, but I tell you, I tell you, I tell you. And the thing about it is, though, is that Jesus doesn't apologize for that even a little bit. Now, what's that got to do with digging a great foundation? The question of life is, who is Jesus to you? Is he the king? Is he really the one that has the kind of authority he obviously claimed for himself? You see, not only were they shocked by his words, you ever had someone come across with authority before? I think they heard his words and they were freaked out, but also he kind of came across as one of those people who had weight about him and had authority about him on a subject, and you could just feel it. I had this experience many years ago. Many of you have heard, possibly, of a woman by the name of Joni Eareckson Tada. Joni Eareckson Tada, there's a picture of her. When she was a teenager, she was with her family and she dove off a dock that was out in the middle of a lake and hit her head on the bottom because it was more shallow than she thought, snapped her neck back and paralyzed her from the neck down. But through that experience, she has had a massive impact around the world, written books and all these things. And I got to hear her speak. This is years ago. And I can tell you, when they rolled her out there and she told that story, and she talked about how God was present in her weakness and how she dealt with the fact that God never healed her of these things and all that kind of stuff, you knew she had authority. As a matter of fact, I wanted to pull at least one quote from Joni. You could hear the way she talks. Listen to this. This is from Joni Eareckson. She said, quote, "Come on, admit it. When your heart is being wrung out like a sponge, when you feel like Morton salt is being poured into your wounded soul, you don't want a thin, pale, emotional Jesus who relates only to lambs and birds and babies. You want a warrior Jesus. You want a battlefield Jesus. You want his rigorous and robust gospel to command your sensibilities to stand at attention." Now, someone who talks that way, out of what she experienced, you're kind of like, yes, I do. Amen, ma'am. She has authority. And that's the way it was with Jesus. If you want a solid foundation, you've got to answer the question fundamentally in life. What kind of authority does Jesus have in your life? Is he the king? Is he the one in charge? Or are you the king or queen? Are you the one in charge? You kind of look to him and say, he's the one I ought to be following. He's the voice I ought to be listening to. Now, along with that is a second ingredient that goes into a solid foundation that both groups had in common. He says, he who hears these words of mine, but he who hears these words of mine. These words of mine. What's interesting about Jesus, if you study his life, he was very enamored not only with his own authority, but with his own words. He put a lot of weight on his own words. As a matter of fact, he was standing before Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman procurator who had the authority, on an earthly authority to say whether he lived or died. And Pilate and he are having a conversation, and Pilate asked him, "Hey, are you a king? You come across like a king. Are you a king?" It says, Jesus replied, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching." Oh, I'm sorry. Quoted the wrong one. John 18:37. His reply says this: "You say correctly that I'm a king. For this I have been born, and for this I've come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." In other words, he equated the words that he said with the truth. He said, I have come into the world to testify to the truth. And I say this all the time, but it's so desperately needed. Guys, we live in the era historians call the communication revolution. I mean, we are getting communicated with on a daily basis, far and away more than any other generation in the history of mankind, through podcast and YouTube and Netflix, and it goes on and on and on. Our phones we're constantly downloading communication, and what we desperately need is one voice to sort it all out for us. And Jesus said the reason he was born is to say what was true, is to say what's true. And my question to all of us would be, are his words truth to you? He who hears these words, are you listening to his words? You see, anybody can claim to kind of, they can wear Jesus' t-shirt and they can put his bumper sticker on their car. But some people who do that have very little clue of what he ever said about anything. They just kind of name Jesus. Hey, I like Jesus in sort of a general way. But do you love the Jesus who actually spoke words? Listen what he says about that. This is one I accidentally read a while ago. This is John chapter 14. The night before he died, he said to his followers, Jesus replied, "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words that you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me." He put a ton of emphasis on his teaching. His conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount was after he had said, he opened up again with blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on and he talks about a series of relationships in our lives. He talks about our relationship with other people, those who have offended us, our enemies. He talks about marriage and divorce. He talks about our relationship with money, with the future, with our inward selves and our motivations, our worries, our anxieties. He talks about our relationship with those who are under-resourced. He talks about being generous. He talks about in other words, you know what he does? He talks about almost the whole of life. It wasn't this little corner when you come over to church and hear nice little motivating speeches. He talked about the whole of life. He had something to say and something to teach about the fundamental nature of all of life, how you do your work, how you apply yourself in your family, what your motivations are like. He talked about prayer. He talked about fasting. His teaching mattered a whole lot. And some of us don't even know what his teaching is. The people that I've seen, almost to the person, who have had load-bearing foundations, I mean, have gone through things you just can't imagine, and still stood, and still had Jesus kind of oozing out of who they were, are almost invariably people who are students of his words. Now, here's something very important to remember, too. In Jesus' words and in his teaching, one of the things that he said was that Old Testament part of the Bible, he talks about Moses and all that, he says, that's about me. So in other words, he gives credibility to that part. He also assigned his immediate followers, his disciples, to follow him and record his words. You know what that is? That's the rest of the New Testament. In other words, when we say his words and his teaching, ultimately, he's talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament. He's talking about the Bible itself as we know it. I've quoted too many times, there's a study that's done that showed that the most important thing you can do if you want to grow spiritually, they've proven this, is engage with the Bible in a prayerful way. Well, I've quoted a study for years and years and years. Well, I found out just recently 2 other research projects were done for 8 to 10 years long. How do people grow? How do people grow? How do people dig deep foundations? You know what they found? The other 2 studies? Same exact thing. That the people who engage with his words, with his teaching, are the people that stand, are the people that grow. Engage with his words. Take his words in. Listen to what his words are. But that brings me to the third ingredient. And it's this. And this is where he makes the differentiation. He says, everybody that heard him, that heard his words, they heard him, they were amazed at his authority. They had listened to his words. Some of them were probably cried over his words. They thought, wow, this is awesome. But remember what he said. The thing that made the difference was he who hears these words of mine and acts on them is like the one who built his house on a rock. He who hears these words of mine and does not act on them is like the one who built his house on the sand. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. For one, it kind of introduces a problem, if I'm being real honest. When you look at that, so the differentiating factor, all 3 ingredients, one group had 2 of the 3 ingredients. The other group had a 3rd ingredient called action, called movement, called doing the things that he actually said to do. Now, here's the problem that it introduces, is that we say, and Jesus gave us this, that the good news that the church proclaims, the good news, is that you don't qualify to get into the kingdom of God. You don't qualify to get into the kingdom of heaven. You don't. You can't get into the kingdom of heaven on your own. You're fundamentally flawed. If you come to God, you have no actions to commend yourself. You can't say, I gave this, or I did that, or I'm a really nice person. It's not going to qualify you. You can't enter that way. That's what's really interesting about that. And the good news is because of the life, because of the death, because of the resurrection of Jesus, he says you can have free entry. You don't have to do those actions. I did the actions for you. All you have to do is trust what I did on the cross for your sake, and you can be free. That is the good news. Now, what's up with the act thing? I think there's a couple things. Because what I just said was the truth. Actions aren't required for you to get in the kingdom of heaven. You don't have to be a good person. You just have to trust Christ. So why did he focus on actions? 2 things are going on. Remember his very first words that he started the Sermon on the Mount with? How he started the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read it to you. it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The first way to apply his teaching, did you hear that? Is blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You want to go into the kingdom of heaven? The first thing you have to recognize is your spiritual poverty, that you're not that person, that you have weaknesses. Do you have weaknesses? Do you have issues? If God were to just kind of assess your life today, how would you measure up? Or do you have poverty of spirit? That's the entry place. So in other words, the people who are in the kingdom of heaven, and here's something that's very important to note before we kind of elaborate on this. When we say kingdom of heaven, and Jesus says kingdom of heaven, and by the way, scholars think of the Sermon on the Mount as the constitution of the kingdom of heaven. But here's a very important thing. When Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, he was talking about a present reality, not a future hope only. When we hear a kingdom of heaven, we're thinking, well, kingdom of heaven is when I die, and then I'll go to heaven. That's not how Jesus thought of it. He said entrance is possible right now. In other words, the kingdom is coming. You'll get to go to heaven, but the kingdom is designed to come to earth. That's why he talks about marriage and giving to the poor and enemies and all that kind of stuff. You live as residents in the kingdom of heaven now. When you come to Jesus, your eternal life starts right then. Heaven, as we talk about it, is just a continuation in another environment, if you will. Now, why that's important to know is that the entrance to that place here and now is poverty of spirit. It's saying, I don't have anything to commend myself. But then the second thing is this. Why did he say actions? Now, I've used this analogy before. I'm quite confident most of you don't remember it, okay? So I'm going to use it again because I couldn't think of another one. Why does he talk about actions? Faith in the Bible is essentially about three things. Number one, it's intellectual. I got to know the facts. I got to know Jesus claims to be resurrected from the dead. He's the king of all the earth. I have to believe in the intellectual content of things. He died on the cross. He rose again from the dead. Faith is intellectual first. But faith also has another dimension that includes, out of the intellectual, I have a trusting relationship with someone. If I really do believe that Jesus rose again from the dead and he's king of all the earth, I'll step into a trusting relationship with him. But here's the analogy I've used before, and here's what he's getting to here. There's a difference between trusting and believing and acting. And here's the difference. Conviction. Now, conviction, I'm not talking about guilt kind of conviction, or I feel guilty about something. I'm talking about, and here's the analogy. I've heard there's a movie out. I haven't seen this. Some of you have seen it. The Bird Box, or the Bird Cage, or the Bird something or other. The Bird Box is Sandra Bullock is and apparently it's Netflix, like a big deal. And a lot of people have seen it. Maybe you've seen it, but the genre of it is a post-apocalyptic, as if that's original. Did you ever notice that almost everything we're into nowadays is post-apocalyptic? Like most people are starting to believe, I think we're approaching the apocalypse. It's kind of interesting with our culture, like it's coming. We're just writing stuff about it. But this is a post-apocalyptic thing. Now there are many of us who might even think that we're going to live to see the day when everything kind of ends, that the life's going to become the Walking Dead, or the ice caps are going to melt and we're going to all be flooded. There's some people that kind of think that way and kind of wonder about it. But most of us, even if we wonder about it and even believe it just a little bit, we can talk about it over lattes in a coffee shop, right? So we kind of toy around with the idea. But what conviction is, it's the people that really, truly do believe that that's going to happen in their lifetime. There are people out there, and they do exist, who believe that we are in a post-apocalyptic, we are approaching an apocalyptic moment. And they really believe it. And therefore, what do? They have bomb shelters in their backyards. They are doing stockpiles of Spam. They're buying generators. In other words, they're getting ready. Why? Because conviction inevitably leads to action. Conviction inevitably leads to action. If you truly believe something, you can't help but act on it. Jesus' words are not okay, you guys need to get out there and get on it. They're really not so much about actions first, they're about examination. He who hears these words of mine and puts these into practice, if you believe in his authority, and you believe his words really matter more than any other words in the world, and you truly believe that, you know what you're going to do? You're going to go over his words and say, this is how I'm supposed to respond to my marriage. This is how I'm supposed to respond to my enemies. This is how I'm supposed to respond. In other words, you're going to put them in action, as stumbling and fumbling as you possibly can be. It doesn't matter. That's how you have a true and deep and real foundation. That's the differentiating factor, because people who truly believe will inevitably act. And that's why he said, that's the third ingredient, that's going to be the difference between a house that falls and a house that stays. That's how it works. So you think about it, in perfectly nice blue sky weather, both houses look very similar. One's on the beach. He's having a good time. But the real test comes when the rains fall, when the floods rise, and when the winds slam. That's the test. And if you want to stand, you got to believe in his authority. You got to take in his words. But you've got to make them become conviction to the point where you're actually acting. Now, across all three of our campuses, I want you to do a simple thing. Just kind of put your head down. You don't necessarily have to close your eyes, because I'm not going to pray at first. I want to have a little bit of think time here. And I'm going to give you 3 questions to think over. Just to yourself, that's why we're just going to let things be kind of quiet. And the first question is this: what do I really think of Jesus and his authority in life? What do I think of Jesus and his authority? Just kind of look and what's your own belief about that? Forget what you've been raised on. Forget what you know the answer's supposed to be. Really, truly examine where I am on his authority. Is he the one in charge? Is he the king? Or am I the king, or someone else the king? Just ask yourself that and think about it. Second question: am I a student of his words? Am I a student of his words? And this isn't designed for guilt. It's just a personal assessment of, do I really look into his words and look into the Bible? Do I process them and think about how I should respond in different situations based on his words? Or do I just occasionally hear things? Just take a moment to think about that. And then finally, does my life show I'm acting on his words? Because that's the real difference. Does my life show I'm acting on his words, or is there very little distinction between me and anybody else who doesn't care about his words one way or the other? Does my life show I'm acting on his words? And if you've kind of answered any of those in the negative, one thing you can be encouraged by is his words include, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The starting place for anyone who comes into the kingdom is to say, Lord, I don't do your words, not even a little. I've broken most of the things that I know you said. Or I've just ignored these things. Even if you have a time where you prayed or you were baptized, or whatever, I just ignore these things for most of my life. Acknowledge your poverty of spirit and say, Jesus, change me. And for those of us who maybe did okay, use the opportunity in prayer to draw closer. Father, in Jesus' name, I come before you and I thank you for the gift, sending your son Jesus to the earth to speak great words of authority, to speak great words of life. And Lord, I pray that in our poverty of spirit, all of us will act on them. And that as we go into our city, we're living as citizens of the kingdom, that we are acting on the words that Jesus gave, and we can bless our city because we are people of action, not just of words, not just sitting here listening to teaching, but we actually convert it over into the things that we are truly and deeply convicted about. I ask you for that power because we don't have it of ourselves. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.